All righty. And we are live. Welcome in, everybody. This is episode number 129 of Calibrated with Scott. I am the host, of course, Scott. Today with me, we have the one, the only from the New Atlas YouTube channel, Brian J. Berletic. How are you doing today, Brian?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, thank you for coming back. I know that my show is not quite up to the analytical standard that yours is. Everybody, make sure you go check out Brian's fantastic shows. He puts it together perfectly, delivers a very clear message, and always gets a poignant point across in every single episode that he does. So make sure you guys go over and check out Brian's page. If you like my work, you will definitely like Brian's work. Brian, when was the last time we talked? It was like a month ago.
I think about a month ago, but don't sell yourself short because I just want people to know I actually follow you on Telegram because I cannot sit there and sift through like hundreds of Telegram channels. You do a very good job consolidating all of it and presenting it in a coherent manner. And you really have a good sense of what is going on the ground on a day-to-day basis. And for someone who, from my knowledge, you've never been in the military, you do a very good job breaking it down, much better than these so-called military experts across the Western information sphere.
Well, thank you so much. You heard it here first. Somebody clip that, please, in chat. Clip that. I appreciate that. I do try my best, but self-deprecation is usually a much easier way to get a host or a guest in a spotlight. So let's just hop right into it. We've seen continued Russian advances in Ukraine. Nothing seems to be slowing down. I think we're coming up against a pivotal time where the U.S. is going to have to make a decision on how they're going to go forward with Ukraine. They might have already done that with the Trump administration coming in. And we have seen some new operations being undertaken by the Ukrainians, most recently the whatever you want to call it, Kursk 2.0, the second Kursk incursion. I would like a sort of a, oops, sorry about that. I would like a breakdown of that, in your opinion, of what happened there, what the overall goal was of this operation, and what it means in how it ended. We've seen the results. Obviously, if it didn't last more than 2 weeks, it wasn't hyper successful. So go ahead and take it away from there.
Well, even if it was successful, what are they claiming is success? Are they claiming taking vacant land in an area that Russia is obviously interested in containing the area of operation of Ukraine, but they're not worried that they're going to break through and reach Moscow? And at this point, and this is what we warned about when the first Kursk incursion began, was that Ukraine has limited manpower, equipment, and ammunition, even along the actual line of contact. By committing large amounts of their best manpower and equipment to Kursk, they're actually depleting their defenses where they actually need to be, where they're desperately short of manpower, equipment, and ammunition. So the longer and the more they invest and the longer they invest in Kursk, the worse it will be for the actual line of contact. We watched Russian advances accelerate all along the line of contact because of that. And then the Western media even began admitting that themselves. So it defies logic. What they're doing is for public relations. It is a way of trying to depict Ukraine as not losing, not facing defeat, not facing all of these growing crises. And I even heard Kuleba, I think he was being interviewed by the BBC very recently, talking about this most recent, I don't know if you could even call it an offensive in Kursk, a counter attack, maybe, I don't know. But he was even admitting that this is to prove that Ukraine hasn't lost yet. If you look at even the Western headlines, you can see the very negative, pessimistic tone that is taking shape.
Yes.
And Ukraine and their Western backers are obsessed with public perception. They want to keep this going for as long as possible. They need to convince the Western public to support this for as long as possible. Most importantly, they need to convince the Ukrainians themselves to continue fighting, that this is not hopeless. It is hopeless. So how do you make it look like there is hope? You perform a stunt like this in Kursk. You get superficial success, even if it's very minimum. You use your control over the media and information space across the West to pump it up much larger than it actually is. And maybe you buy a couple of more weeks where you can convince people to continue marching off to their death. That's how I see this most recent Kursk attack. I had actually believed that this must have been a diversion or something, because it's just so transparently wasteful and futile. But I think that actually may be what they were doing. They were just trying to score public relation points as usual.
It was, in my opinion, and I would assume you would agree, I think it really is a microcosm, a picture of, first off, what the Ukrainian military, but mostly political, one and the same at this point, objectives are. It also shows the overall health of the AFU, because if they would have had more to commit to this, I mean, in the beginning of this operation, we actually saw pretty good electronic warfare from this small offensive unit that went in. So it wasn't like it was just throwaway manpower and material. This was a organized, planned operation that resulted in extremely high casualties, high equipment loss. And then the only thing I've really seen come out of it is this now claim. And of course, it comes days after the offensive has failed and the Ukrainians are now losing more of Kursk, that they have captured 2 North Koreans. And I ask you this question because I'm stumped as to what this even means. I mean, you're talking about 2 countries that are strategic partners and they have a defense cooperations, and you're watching North Koreans fighting inside of Russian territory, not inside of Ukraine. What does this do for the Ukrainian position? Because this is the only win that I can see out of this whole thing at all. I mean, even from a purely PR perspective, I think all of the pro-Ukrainians in the information space looked at this second Kursk incursion and just kind of shook their head. I mean, they don't know what it's for. You're losing cities in the east. You're losing the war right now. And then you're just doing this just for brownie points, maybe a little bit more support, or to say that the quote unquote axis of evil is what I always call it. North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China are actively working against Ukraine to defeat Ukraine. That's the only thing I can possibly see. But specifically with this North Korean message that they're trying to push, who are they trying to convince of anything, and what are they trying to convince them of?
I think you kind of touched on it. It's to depict this Asiatic horde coming for the collective West, Western civilization. Ukraine likes to present themselves as the vanguard for white Western civilization. A lot of them are just openly Nazis. And this has been a theme all throughout this entire conflict, going all the way back to 2014 when the U.S. violently overthrew the elected and internationally recognized government of Ukraine. So I think it's playing on that. We have to understand that the conflict in Ukraine is a proxy war between the United States and Russia, the culmination of U.S.-led NATO expansion all along Russia's border periphery. But this is just one part of a much larger conflict where the U.S. seeks to isolate, destabilize, divide, and destroy China. That is the primary target. We were just seeing things in the news about President-elect Donald Trump talking about Greenland, talking about Panama. A lot of people are looking at that in a local, regional, Western Hemisphere kind of way, but actually Greenland is key. It is in the Arctic. it is key to enhancing America's encirclement and containment and agitation of Russia. The Panama Canal is obviously a vital choke point, one of several the U.S. needs to close down to stop Chinese maritime shipping internationally. And so that is what the U.S. is working its way up to. They have admitted in policy papers that if they do try to impose a maritime blockade on China, and they'll do it in a way beyond the reach of China's military, because its military is designed to defend just China. They do not have the ability to project military power, say, break a blockade in the Middle East, for example, or to sail to the Panama Canal and fight the U.S. there. They don't have the ability to do that, which is why the U.S. wants to implement a blockade this way. But they understand that Russia, with its natural resources and sharing a very long border with China, they could just send resources directly into China. So they understand that they have to get rid of Russia first if they want to isolate and deal with China ultimately. So there's a lot to that we have to understand when we're looking at this conflict. The other thing we have to understand about this conflict is that it's not necessarily the U.S. trying to defeat Russia militarily in Ukraine. They're trying to overextend Russia overall in Ukraine, in Syria, in Georgia, in Kazakhstan, in the Arctic, in Africa. It's a whole array of battlefields the U.S. is working across to try to overextend and eventually collapse Russia. And Russia has limits. And we saw that in Syria. So we have to keep all of this in mind while we look at this conflict as it plays out. I don't know if that answered your question. I kind of forgot.
No. It was you answered it and then you went past it. So it was fantastic. Coming over to Syria, since we're right here, I wanted to get your updated opinion. I think we talked about Syria the last time we were in here. I think it had happened, but it was still kind of playing out as we were talking about it. I'm curious as to how you think it played out. Obviously big winners and losers in Syria. I'm curious as to your opinion on that. And how do you see it playing out for Russia in the future in the Middle East, but more so without the Middle East?
It's a huge setback for obviously the Syrian people, obviously for Russia as well. There's a lot of talk about whether Russia is going to keep its military bases there. I don't think that they will. I think they would be foolish to try to keep them there. There's nobody that they can deal with that can be trusted. So that was a huge setback. But then again, so was the collapse of Libya. And that was an instance where Russia could not intervene because, again, they're not all powerful. There's serious limits to what they're able to do, especially in terms of projecting military power beyond their borders. So there's that. Now, yes, obviously, the U.S. has succeeded in overthrowing the Syrian government. They've placed literal listed terrorists and terrorist organizations into power in Syria. The collective West always makes it out as if there's this prerequisite that has to be fulfilled in order for the West to do business with your country. And then we had the German foreign minister, who was a woman, go to Syria, and this puppet that they've installed into power refused to shake her hand. Now, if that was a cultural thing and everyone lived and let live, you could look past that. But the fact that the West always cites these prerequisites in order to do business, or uses these prerequisites as a pretext to isolate, sanction, even invade and overthrow a government, the fact that they're ignoring this just shows you the true colors of the collective West and what they're really doing. They don't actually care about any of these principles. Is a smokescreen that they're using. So the biggest takeaway, though, from Syria is that Russia has limits to its power, and we see that limit. They were not able to continue committing to Ukraine and also commit enough resources to prop up the Syrian government and military. It was being sanctioned. It was isolated. It was cut off. It was being systematically attacked and undermined by the U.S., by its regional proxies, including especially Israel, but also Turkey, which was occupying northern Syria and building up this horde of terrorists that eventually overran the country. So people have to keep that in mind. They often say, well, what's taking Russia so long in Ukraine? Again, there is a much larger conflict unfolding that Russia has to keep in mind. And there's limits, and we see that in Syria. They have to also take into account other contingencies, like say, the situation in Georgia or the situation in Belarus. The U.S. has attempted to overthrow the government in Belarus multiple times. Kazakhstan. In the Arctic, again, President-elect Donald Trump, not even in office yet, talking about, or at least alluding to, the possibility of expanding military operations in Greenland, which would force Russia to react. That is the whole point of it. That's what it spells out in that Rand Corporation document from 2019, extending Russia. It's mentioned the Arctic many times, as a matter of fact. So I think that's what we need to keep in mind in regards to Syria. It's not a permanent situation. It can be changed. Things can improve there for the people, for the region, for multipolarism, but it's going to take time. People have to be patient and see the big picture and not get too hung up on the here and now.
So maybe I'm just naive on this topic, but when I look at Syria and from the Russian perspective, 2012, or they got involved in 2015, but 2012 to 2018, 2019, Syria seemed like a more realistic option. The ability to prop it up, as you said, Russia not being overextended. But after U.S. occupation of Syria, after the settlement between the Idlib region and the Damascus government, along with the pressure from both the Iranian side and the Israeli side, do you think that Russia was potentially overextended before this happened? I mean, obviously, if they were overextended when it happened, they were overextended after or before. But to me, it almost looks like Russia got out of the entire Syria situation kind of scot-free, almost. They got all of their equipment out for the most part. They're, sending it to Africa right now or back into Russia. They're still maintaining their bases, although I agree with you. I don't think that they're going to keep them. I don't think that there's a reason to keep them. I think that overextends them and just puts them into a bad situation in a hostile environment. And I don't know what the Russians were necessarily getting out of Syria anymore. The United States controlled the oil. I feel like it was putting them at greater odds with Turkey, which now that seems to be slightly, that at least that specific area is slightly resolved. And now the Turkish seem to be at odds more with the United States and the PPK or the YPG, the Kurds in the northeastern portions of Syria. Is that a realistic view, or do you think Russia really lost some geostrategic interests in this region? Because if you just move those bases to Africa, doesn't that almost provide the same sphere of influence? And in Africa, they have potentially more friendly governments.
Well, these are all really good points, and a lot of people are looking at it that way. I think the primary reason Russia was in Syria, though, was because once Syria is overrun and politically captured by the United States, destroyed essentially, the way is paved for moving on to Iran. And that is what, from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, this has all been set up by both administrations, and they're just handing it off to the Trump administration. They're going to go full speed at Iran. And so this is why Russia was concerned. This is why Iran obviously was concerned, because they understand that once Iran is undermined, destabilized, overthrown, if that ends up happening, that further isolates Russia itself. It also further isolates China itself. So again, you have to look at the entire planet basically as a chessboard, not to reduce it to a board game, but to help people understand. And each piece is extremely important. You cannot afford to just throw these pieces away. If you have the ability to hold them, you hold them. The problem is Russia did not have the ability to hold them. Yes, they're going to expand their influence in Libya. And that is an example of how a short-term setback, the destruction of Libya, and again, not to trivialize what happened to the Libyan people, but in the long term, Russia understood that if we do something in the short term, we're going to overextend ourselves and we might lose everywhere. If we're patient and we think long term, maybe there will be an opportunity in the future for us to get in on one side and help restore the nation of Libya, which is currently warring with itself and dysfunctional for all intents and purposes, not a nation state. They're also thinking the same thing in regards to Syria. But ultimately, this isn't about a sphere of influence or expanding Russian interests abroad. This is about fighting and defending against this global agenda of the United States to encircle Russia, to isolate it, isolate Iran, isolate China, and eliminate these nations. And the U.S. is trying to do it in detail, defeat in detail these nations, these pillars of multipolarism, and there's a lot of hard decisions and a very long, difficult conflict ahead to defend against this.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is a chess piece, obviously. I don't know what that chess piece was really doing for Russia at this point. Like I said, 2018 made sense, but the Mediterranean has lost a lot more of its Russian presence. So even having ports and bases there, I don't feel like it was yielding Russia anything. But I do agree. You don't want to lose pieces that you don't have to lose. And it's obviously a sign of overextension. So I just wanted to say, guys, if you ask questions, we will be doing a short Q&A at the end with all of the questions that you guys ask. So I'm not ignoring them. We're just going to save them for the end. I wanted to bring it back to.
I just one more thing, because I do agree with you. It did not make sense for Russia to say double down on Syria. The situation was hopeless, and so in that sense, Russia was understood. We're overextended. It doesn't make sense. We have to cut our losses and move on, because if we double down, and this is the thing about Russia that sets it apart from the collective West. Collective West is so obsessed with the image of domination and power that they will not suffer short-term political humiliation for long-term strategic gains. Russia does this all the time. They have no problem with it at all. Remember the retreats from Kherson and Kharkov, and immensely embarrassing and humiliating. And we remember the pro-Russian information sphere having a meltdown over this. But in the long term, you can see how it served their interests, and how for Ukraine it was a long-term strategic disaster, that offensive. And so that's how they're looking at Syria. It's a short-term loss. It didn't make any sense to double down on it. If there is an opportunity in the future to try to rehabilitate Syria, restore Syria as a functioning nation state, a sovereign nation state, free from Western domination, then they will. I'm sure that they will.
Yeah. All right. So now moving a little bit back to Ukraine, Trump is coming into office on the 19th. Is his inauguration, or the 20th, 19th? Anyway, he has made a lot of large claims, said things such as he's going to end the conflict in 24 hours. I don't think anybody rational or reasonable thought that was true. Now we're seeing articles. I talked about it in my last live stream about how the Trump team is now talking about a 6-month negotiation process period after they come into office. Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts. It's going to take time. But we have Europe coming out, most European countries coming out and saying that they are not on board with that. They're actually, it seems like there's quite a bit of tension right now between the EU and the United States. Not that there always is, but under the Biden administration, it seemed a little bit more narrative driven. They were all on the same page. Now it seems like there's a little bit of back and forth there. I'm curious as to, with the new information you've seen, how things have been coming up. How does the Trump administration approach this? I, for a long time, have said that the president of the United States doesn't really matter, doesn't change U.S. foreign policy, because the U.S. has specific geostrategic goals and interests, and an administration is not going to shift those that much. There are basic requirements and needs of the United States right now. So what do you think is, first, I would like to know what your recommendation would be to Trump in terms of how to approach this conflict and how to make it, thinking about it from a U.S. perspective. As you said, they are never able to really back down. They will always double down in exchange for reducing short-term embarrassment. How would you realistically advise the Trump administration going forward after their inauguration? And then what do you think they're actually going to do?
Well, the problem for the Trump administration and any administration, let's just pretend for a minute that they were in charge and they were serious about ending the war, which they aren't. I mean, President-elect Trump's comments about Greenland tells you that his administration is absolutely enthusiastically committed to encircling and containing Russia. That's the whole point of even mentioning Greenland. There's no other reason to mention Greenland. So there's that. And so all of this talk about ending the war, this is he's playing to his support base, which is what the president, that is what he does. He divides and distracts the public. Half of the country is going to support him and he's going to play to them, and half is going to hate him and despise him. And then there's a switch in office, and then the roles reverse. So if you were actually interested in ending the conflict, you have to admit why there's a conflict in the first place. There's a conflict in the first place because the U.S. has politically captured Europe and is expanding its politically captured territory up to Russia's border with the full intention of politically capturing Russia itself. And just to give you an idea of what they imagine Russia in the future to be like if they had their way, it would look like the Russian Federation right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where the collective West was just pillaging the country, draining it of resources, destroying human resources. That's what they want to do. Again, this is what Russia is responding to. We have policy papers spanning decades.
I'm here.
Has disappeared.
I'm here. You're good.
All right. Talking about this. This is the goal, and this is the goal no matter who is president, no matter who is in Congress. So if you admit that that is the reason why, then you have to, the negotiations you would have with Russia would be security architecture in Europe, giving Europe its sovereignty back, allowing Europe to do business with Russia like they were before the special military operation began, returning things back to the status quo, and then maybe enhancing the status quo with some sort of sense of mutual respect between the US, Europe, and Russia. It's not very hard to do. Almost every other country around the world that's how they deal with other countries. This is what the United States would do. This is what a president serious about fixing the problem, this is what they would be doing. For the Trump administration, for people who will make the excuse that, well, he can't just come out and say that. He can just pin the whole thing on the Biden administration. Say, this was the Biden administration's fault. This was their mess, and we're going to clean it up, and this is how we're going to do it. And they could start with a totally clean page. People are making excuses because they don't want to admit that the Trump administration is a representation of continuity of agenda. And that is it.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. And I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my camera. It's been cutting in and out. Okay. And I've been trying to fix it for like 3 weeks now, and I haven't been able to figure out. So I might have to leave in a second, but I'm going to ask you another question. So do you see the Trump administration increasing support or decreasing support based off of how Ukraine is performing and how they want to go forward? And I'm going to let you talk, and I'm going to just back out and come right back in and see if I can get my camera to work.
Okay. Well, this is a good question, because what this is essentially is, even before the presidential election, the United States was running out of arms and ammunition to send to Ukraine. We remember even the Western media admitting all of this. They're out of air defense missiles, they're out of air defense systems, they're out of artillery shells, they don't have enough armored vehicles to send to Ukraine, not armored vehicles that would make any kind of difference, no armored vehicles that are practical to give Ukrainians who are unfamiliar with them. And this is the same problem across all of Europe. So there is no way to, how are they going to increase support for Ukraine? This was something that even the Trump administration, or at least people in its orbit, were saying that Russia needs to negotiate, and if they don't, we're just going to open the faucet and all the arms and ammunition are going to flow in. What arms, what ammunition, what are you going to send them? They haven't sent them already. If there was anything to send Ukraine, it would have been sent already. It doesn't exist. They don't have it. So what could the collective West do? Why is the US, why is Europe trying to figure out what to do now with the conflict? The Ukrainian military is incrementally being hollowed out, and eventually it's going to collapse. And it may not happen all at once. I think we can already kind of see it collapsing incrementally in slow motion. And we see the Russian military advancing at an accelerated rate. It's not linear. It's accelerating. So they have to make a decision. Are we just going to accept that Russia is going to eventually hollow out and collapse Ukraine's fighting capacity, or are we going to intervene? And that's why they're talking about this. That's why they desperately want a ceasefire. That is something that the Biden administration would have been pushing if it got another 4 years in office. And that is what the Trump administration very clearly is setting up. They're not going to negotiate, and they want a freeze to the conflict. And for Russia, it makes absolutely no sense to freeze the conflict, because all that's going to do is do exactly what we just saw happen in Syria. It will give the US time to rebuild Ukraine up militarily, and then they will initiate another round of violence where they feel they'll be in a better position and possibly achieve a better outcome. And if Russia did agree to a freeze of the conflict, that would indicate that they have reached serious limits to what they are able to do. You cannot rule it out. And if they do it, that is the reason why they will do it, because they need time. They're reaching their limit. So it can't be ruled out. We don't, we hear from the Western media, the Russian economy is going to collapse any day for the last 3 years. We've been hearing that. They're going to run out of weapons any day for the last 3 years. And then on the Russian side, they say we can do this all day. We can keep going. We're not going to run out of anything, and we're going to achieve all of our goals. So these are the two stories playing out. Which one is true? Only time will tell. We could look at the evidence. It seems to suggest that Russia can sustain this, at least in the short to intermediate term. So if they can, they absolutely must, because that's the only way they'll achieve their objectives, which is to completely put a hold on this expansion of NATO up to their border, and this attempt to eventually absorb Russia itself. It's existential for them.
It is. Now, the Ukrainian position, I don't even know if this is going to be taken into consideration, which is kind of funny to say that the Ukrainian position in the Ukrainian war doesn't matter. But the current regime seems utterly opposed to negotiations still. Just yesterday came out and said that they were not in any position to negotiate. They didn't want to negotiate. I don't think Russia is going to go for a ceasefire. As you said, it would be a sign that things are much worse underneath the surface than what we can see, and they need a reprieve from the fighting, and potentially sanctions is another aspect of this, where I could see if they achieved some sort of high-level sanction relief, there could be negotiations. And I don't know if the U.S. is willing to do that. I doubt they are. And so I've said the entire time that all of the negotiating positions are so far removed from each other that there's not going to be any way for an agreement to come about with Russia. And I've always thought that just like you think, I see Russia in a position of strength currently. I think, at least militarily on the battlefield. I don't see any reason for them to negotiate. Just like they talked about the Kursk incursion being a way to potentially have a bargaining chip for negotiations. I don't really see how that works at all, because Kursk, to me, and how I imagine it looks to the Russians, is a crossing of a border which should not have been crossed. And additionally, it's not benefiting the Ukrainians at all. So it seems like if the Russians let the Ukrainians get out of Kursk, that would be the negotiating position. Like, yeah, no, we're going to let you leave with, intact or whatever, peacefully. That seems like the negotiation position, and that puts Russia into an even stronger position. So, I personally don't see any negotiations happening. Do you see any negotiations happening in the near to mid future?
It's important to remember that the United States is not interested in negotiating.
Yeah.
Its ultimate goal is to eliminate Russia and China as peer or near peer adversaries. Yeah. You mentioned sanction relief. This is a key topic. I was reading out of the Kiev Independent. Take it for what it's worth. They claim that they're in contact with 10 different Russian elites. They don't name who they are. Do they exist? Did they really say this? I don't know. Maybe they did, because I know that there are people like this, say, in Russia, in China, here in Southeast Asia. And they were talking about how the war isn't going to end. The outlook is grim for them. They want to be making more profits. They want to get back to business as usual. They want sanction relief. You're not going to get sanction relief. Look at Iran. How long have they been dangling that over Iran's head? And how many times did they commit to that, thinking somehow they would achieve that? And how many times has it been yanked away from them? It is a stalling tactic. They admit it in their policy papers. Negotiations are meant to make the collective West look like they're the ones pursuing diplomacy, and it's their adversary who is irrational. The collective West will sabotage the negotiations or the terms to whatever agreement. They will retract sanction relief, and they will start it all over again. With the time that they've bought, they've been able to rearm, regroup, whichever proxies they're using to torment whatever country is being targeted and sanctioned. And then the whole thing starts all over again. And this nation waiting for sanction relief that was never, ever going to come. They had no intention of ever genuinely implementing it. They're going to be in a weaker state. So that's what Russia has to look forward to if they decide to negotiate. And there are people in business in these countries who are naive enough to think that there is some way for them to restore their relationship with the collective West, like in the good old days, whatever that even was, instead of understanding that you need to face and overcome this crisis. This short to intermediate term pain is going to lead to long-term sustainable prosperity, but only if you go through this process. This desperation to eliminate short-term pain, again, it's a flaw in human nature, unfortunately, and there's just too many people that still buy into this. And instead of looking at it objectively and accepting that the situation is tough and they're going to have to make sacrifices, they want to take a shortcut. There are no shortcuts.
Yeah, no, and I would be very. It would like shock me if we saw this thing come to an end in the near future, just because of exactly what we talked about. How many times, I mean, Minsk 1, Minsk 2 are enough. Nord Stream getting blown up, Istanbul negotiations. I mean, you've been through it time and time again. And I know that we on here like to talk a year in the future. We seem to be 9 months ahead of everybody else when it comes to the obvious, which is wild to me, that people don't see exactly what is about to happen with the experience of what has happened in the past. I mean, everything has gone exactly the way you've talked about in the RAND papers. I mean, they lay it out for you exactly how they're going to go forward. I personally can't see any reason why Putin would negotiate at this point. And if he did, it would detract from my respect that I have for him as an individual. Obviously, I don't know everything going on behind the scenes. I'm not there, but that would be like fool me once, fool me 8 times, and I'm still falling for it. I mean, I just can't see that happening. So I'm in agreement with you there. I had some questions about China. It does appear that China is really starting to put the pedal on the metal, the pedal to the metal in terms of their militarization and what looks like preparations for an operation around Taiwan. Not that they're actually going to go through with it, but before, I guess you could potentially say the Nancy Pelosi visit, it seemed like China was prepared to go about Taiwan in the long, slow route, which I would assume is the proper way of going about it, right? Economically, culturally, bring Taiwan back into the fold over time. That sort of direction seems to be shifting slightly, and now it appears that the Chinese are preparing militarily to isolate Taiwan, surround it, do whatever they need to do, and not potentially invade, but just be ready in case the U.S. tries to turn Taiwan into another Ukraine. Not that they're going to have the capabilities to necessarily do that, but have that being the opening salvo of the eventual war on China. Do you see this being at least my observation being correct? And have you seen a shift in any of the language that the Chinese government or Chinese media outlets have been using towards Taiwan? I'm curious as to your perspective on that.
All very good questions, and I'll get to that in just a minute. I think it's important to go back to what you said about Minsk 1, Minsk 2, all of these negotiations. And I mean, we remember Russian President Vladimir Putin talking during his end-of-year press conference Q&A about how if he could do things again, he would have launched a special military operation earlier. I don't know if Russia would have been able to launch it earlier or not. Yeah. I think a lot of people criticize Russia for going through Minsk 1, Minsk 2, but in many ways, the Russian military was not ready to launch the special military operation. Even when they actually launched it, it wasn't ready. And I guess you could argue you will never be satisfied and believe you're fully ready for something like that. But they were rebuilding their military since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were working on it for years and years and years. Their military industrial base, their weapon systems, everything. That is what led up to what we are seeing in the operation right now. So, like I said, if they do negotiate, it might be because they need more time, not necessarily because they're being fooled by the West again. But it would still be a bad sign. I think we can agree on that. Now, take that and carry over to the conversation about China. A lot of people say, why isn't China doing more? Shouldn't they be doing more? Don't they know this is all ultimately aimed at them? Again, the answer is they're not actually ready. They don't have a military that can project power around the globe like the United States does. People take it for granted what the United States is able to do. It has built up global infrastructure, hundreds of bases spanning the globe on every inhabited continent, basically. To do that, it's not something that China can replicate overnight. They can't just say, oh, Syria is about to collapse, let's send 40,000 troops to Syria. It just doesn't work like that in real life. Now, what you're talking about in terms of Taiwan is very important. People have to understand that Taiwan is internationally recognized as part of China. It is an island province of China. Nobody on planet Earth recognizes Taiwan, the island, as an independent country. No one on planet Earth. Not even the people in Taipei, who are this installed client regime of the U.S. Officially, they're referred to as the Republic of China. In their own constitution, it talks about how Taiwan is an island province of all of China. The administration in Taipei poses as the sole legitimate government of all of China, which shows how absurd all of this is. And when you read the Western media, they never mention any of this. But if you go to the State Department's official website, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the UK, in Australia, any country in Europe, they admit this. This is their official stance. One China policy. There's one China. Taiwan is part of China. There's one government. It's the People's Republic of China in Beijing. So very important to understand that before we talk about Taiwan itself. The United States is and has been for the longest time betraying its own agreement with China over the status of Taiwan. They have been sending it billions and billions of dollars worth of arms and ammunition. They've been increasing this in recent years. They have once again, and at one point, people don't realize this, they had thousands of troops stationed on Taiwan, the US. And part of the agreement when they committed to the one China policy was to withdraw all of their troops and to eventually end arms shipments. Well, now they've continued the arms shipments, and now they have US troops back on Taiwan. So that is another point people have to understand. The US, in contravention of international law, has its troops in what is internationally recognized as Chinese territory. By right, China has every right to go and respond militarily to this, but they aren't. Just like you said, Scott, they're thinking long-term. They are confident that in the long term, short of the U.S. provoking an armed conflict, they will be able to fully reunify Taiwan with the rest of China. It's already a process ongoing. If you look at the economy, the local economy of Taiwan, the majority of their exports go to the rest of China. Imports come from the rest of China, and these are key imports that they need for their electronic component industry and their semiconductor industry. Their two biggest, most important industries. Now China has Fujian province right across the strait from Taiwan province, and they have created a special zone where people from Taiwan can set up businesses on the mainland. They can get special papers and status, basically seen as just another Chinese person, basically, and take advantage of the benefits of a rising China. And they understand that in the long term, this is going to work out for them. So what is the U.S. going to do? They see this. They understand time is working against them. They're going to do everything in their power to, like you say, Scott, provoke a Ukraine-style confrontation with China. And they're going to try to do it in a way that makes China look like the aggressor. Even though, as I explained, it is the U.S. interfering in what is internationally recognized. It's worse than Ukraine because Ukraine is not internationally recognized as Russian territory.
Yeah.
Taiwan is.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it so much worse. But people are so brainwashed, they don't understand any of these details. So China has to prepare for the contingency of some sort of armed conflict over Taiwan, precipitated by the U.S. and the client regime that they've installed into power in Taipei. And so this is what they're preparing for. The Chinese military versus the U.S. military, if you just put it on paper, it looks like a pretty even match. But when you think about it, the U.S. military is stretched all the way around the globe. China's military is based in China. All of it is in China right now. They have the largest missile force, the most diverse missile force on Earth. They have one of the largest, most advanced integrated air defense systems. They have, they're closing the fighter jet gap. They have warplanes that are as capable as U.S. warplanes. They have missiles, air-to-air missiles that are more capable than U.S. air-to-air missiles. So this, and the Chinese Navy has closed the gap, and they have ships that are as capable as the U.S. The only gap that there remains that is significant is submarine. In submarines, the U.S. still has an advantage in terms of submarines. But if China could avoid that, they would. The U.S. understands that they're at a disadvantage. That's going to be very hard to fight. If they cannot even fight this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, fighting a war with China across the entire Pacific makes no sense at all, which is why for many years, the U.S. has been working on what they call, I think it's offshore control, where they're not going to try to blockade and strangle the Chinese economy. They're not going to try to defeat China militarily in China. They're going to try to strangle its economy by imposing a blockade beyond the reach of Chinese military assets. So again, this is why the Trump administration is talking about the Panama Canal. This is why the U.S. military has been building up in the South China Sea. They talk about defending freedom of navigation. It's Chinese shipping going through the South China Sea. It's all shipping coming from and going to China from all of its trade partners in the region. All of these countries the U.S. claims China is bullying. These are all countries that count China as their largest trade partner. And so that's why the U.S. is there in the South China Sea, is to disrupt, not to protect shipping through there, because it's Chinese shipping. And they have been continuously building up their military presence and enhancing their military presence in Japan, in South Korea, and now the Philippines. And they're building military bases in the Philippines as close as possible to Taiwan itself. So that's what they're preparing for. They've reconfigured the entire U.S. Marine Corps. People were calling President Biden Beijing Biden. And this is, again, the political games that the U.S. uses to blind the American people. All throughout the Biden administration, the U.S. Marine Corps is reconfigured just to interdict Chinese shipping. They got rid of all of their tanks. They reorganized their forces. They brought in new weapons, anti-shipping missiles, and they're going to try to use that to, they say, go island hopping or position Marines to interdict Chinese shipping across the Asia-Pacific region. And then even Greenland, because Greenland is, yes, very close to Russia, and it's very close to the northern route, but China has been working with Russia on the northern route specifically to circumvent attempts by the U.S. to shut down Chinese maritime shipping everywhere else. And one last thing, the Chinese understood this. This is why they were investing in the Belt and Road Initiative. These are trade routes, pipelines, all kinds of infrastructure that go across land that make it very difficult for the U.S. to use its Navy to interdict or cut off. What the U.S. has been doing for years now, though, is backing armed groups, terrorists, opposition groups to block Belt and Road Initiative projects from even being built. And infrastructure that is built, they will use these armed groups to physically attack. They will also attack and kill Chinese engineers in Pakistan. They even attempted to kill the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan. And so in a lot of ways, this war is already taking place.
Yep.
And it's, where people don't realize how serious this actually is. And they're blind to the fact that it doesn't matter who is in the White House, who is in Congress. This has been ongoing since the end of World War II. And it's going to continue until the United States runs its course, essentially, one way or the other.
Is it just pure ignorance? I just from a, as a U.S. citizen, as any citizen of the world, obviously everybody doesn't have time to look into all of this but even from the position of people who pay attention to this very closely, constantly, I hear the same rhetoric repeated over and over again. And, people get so caught up in the U.S. presidential campaigns and, oh, this change, oh, that change. And time and time and time again, we see the exact same things happen. We see no real change coming into effect. I guess this is just, I'm just curious. Why are people so willing to, are you kidding me again with my camera? Why are people so willing to just buy into a lie? Like we've seen it with Ukraine. We've watched it specifically play out with Ukraine. And now we're even seeing the hypocrisy unfold directly in front of our faces. I mean, they talked about international law and respecting sovereign state borders, stuff like this. And the second it turns around, Trump is talking about going into Greenland with military force and securing the Panama Canal and this, that, and the other. And I mean, this is in direct contradiction to the narrative for the past 3 years since this happened. And really the narrative since 2014 when Russia went into Crimea. But they're illegally occupying Syria, so that hypocrisy was there before. They invaded Iraq, they invaded Afghanistan, they bombed Libya, they bombed Belgrade. I mean, this has been happening forever. So why is there just this complete negligence in understanding and comprehending that the US is openly lying about every single thing that they're doing?
Well, I mean, absolutely. It's exceptionalism. The United States and Westerners are brought up from birth and all throughout their life to believe they are exceptional. They are superior. A lot of people are just outright racist on top of it all, but there's definitely, even if they're not racist, they are exceptionalists. They believe the West is inherently superior. And you will see a lot of these kind of, so-called lefty, liberal NGO from America or from Europe. They're here in Southeast Asia, and their attitude, even though they would swear up and down that they're not racist, their attitude is that these people don't know how to run their own affairs, and they need some white people to come and show them the way. And it's been baked in for centuries, generations. This is what the West has always been about all along: imperialism, colonialism. Look at the British Empire. Look at how the United States picked up right where the British ended.
Yeah.
And so it has been a continuation. And if you look at every conflict in the last century and this century, it has all been about the West trying to maintain their empire, trying to maintain their primacy over planet Earth. And we remember, and I show that New York Times article, I have it actually open on my screen coincidentally, 1992, U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. I mean, that is the plan. That has always been the plan. So that's what it's about. A lot of people have this apprehension about China. Because they are so convinced, almost like it's a law of physics, that white Western civilization is superior, period. And if China is surpassing the collective West, the rules of the universe are broken. This is why people are having this kind of meltdown, and they're unable to cope with it. I mean, you see people having mental meltdowns, but people should just if you don't think that you're an exceptionalist, you don't think that you're a race, you have a problem with China, do the research. Follow the truth wherever it brings you, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you. Look at what's going on in China and just admit that they have a system that works better. They're enjoying peace and prosperity at home. And the only threat that they have is not a threat that they're imposing on others, is the threat the United States is imposing on them. And this is what they're responding to. If you look at the facts, those are the facts. Those are the objective facts. And people call me a Chinese shill all the time, but yes, and also a Russian shill. But look at my work and look at what I cite. 100% Western sources, often from the U.S. government itself. Yeah. So that the truth is there. If you want to see it and you're prepared to open your eyes, you can see it. It's ignorance that is imposed on people across the West by the system, which does it deliberately. It's also emotions, like just in Western politics internally are meant to divide and distract people. Yeah. And people cannot see it because they're emotional first, they're rational and logical second. And you see even really smart people who are otherwise great analysts, when it touches on a subject they're emotional about, they flip over to emotions. It's unfortunate. It's reality, and we all have that battle taking place every time we look at information. Are we going to cave into our emotions, or are we going to try to remain objective, logical, and rational? And unfortunately, the vector sum always seems to favor emotions, and that is kind of the danger of the Western system. It's also an advantage the Western system has because the propaganda that they use to prey on the entire planet, including targeting populations in countries, targeted countries like, say, here in Thailand. If they control your information space, it doesn't matter that China objectively offers a better opportunity for Thailand and a better future for Thailand. The West's narratives are able to convince people otherwise, to actually pivot away from their best interests and pursue a path of self-destruction, just like Ukraine is demonstrably doing.
Falling on the
this
sword,
is why.
yeah.
Exactly. And so this is why I always talk about a nation needing to treat this is the 21st century. We have the internet, we have information technology. You need to treat your information space like a national security domain. You need to protect it. The United States cannot dominate it. If the United States dominates your information space, it is as bad as if the United States had a standing army sitting on your physical territory.
And it's another reason they're talking about TikTok and getting TikTok banned, is because they don't control the information on TikTok. They don't want to ban any other information sites. Well, I mean, they probably would if they had the choice, but TikTok is it is literally the like perfect representation of what they can't have. They cannot have an information space controlled by an enemy state, if you will, a state that is going to tell you an opposite of what they want you to believe. And so we saw that with Israel. That was a huge issue on TikTok, was that all of the information about Israel and what they were doing in Gaza was readily available to the American population, and it made the Biden administration look really, really bad because it's the truth. It's right in front of your face. And it's sort of the thing that happened with the Vietnam War, and now that's kind of been tampered down and controlled even more now. So yeah, I fully agree. I think that it is something that every nation should try to do. But then, you know, what the United States is going to use that narrative is that they're trying to control all the information that their population gets, even though hypocritically, that's exactly what they're trying to do. Thank you so much for coming on, Brian. That takes us to an hour. If everybody has questions that they would like to ask, go ahead and get questions in right now. We have one already. Brian, always love your videos. How deep into Dnipro Oblast do you think the Russians, or do you see the Russians pushing? This is actually a question I bring up quite often on my live streams. I think that, in my personal opinion, I think that Oblast's borders will tell you a ton about what the Russian objectives are, how they see this going forward. If the Russians push into the Dnipro Oblast, I believe that is a sign of what is to come. I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
No, I think you bring up a good point. Does Russia have a set plan? I mean, I know that they want to neutralize this threat that the U.S. and NATO are trying to transform Ukraine into. If there is a way they could do that without having to militarily seize the entire country, I think they would want to do that. Me personally, just a sense that I get is that Russia would be best off at least taking everything up to the Dnieper River. That would make a lot of sense. That would be a great way, kind of a middle ground, without taking the entire country. But we have to remember that just like in Syria, if you hollow out a military, at some point there's going to be a collapse, and you don't necessarily have to fight for every inch of territory. Eventually, you will just be able to take all of the territory. And so this is why I have been warning, and many others have been warning since 2022, really. The US and Europe, one way or another, are going to want to establish a buffer zone in whatever is left of Ukraine to prevent Russian forces from taking all of the country. So I think it depends on all of these factors. And I agree with you, Scott. I think keeping an eye on how far Russia goes is going to be a good gauge of how this is going to unfold.
Do you see them pushing into that region?
I would think so. Yes, I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
Yeah, I think. I mean, they're already bombing it, so I imagine that that's probably going to be the next logical step in this conflict, especially if we don't see negotiations immediately following this. Thank you for your super sticker, Stefan. You are more than welcome to ask a question with those, by the way. All right. Well, that's what if you guys have questions, go ahead and get them in quick. What do you think of the recent expulsion of French troops from Senegal, Chad, and Côte d'Ivoire?
Well, I mean, it's, again, this is what we were just talking about. the last century and this century, 20th and 21st century, has been about the collective West trying to cling to its empire. And just the nature of modern economics and technology and military power make it impossible for the collective West to cling on to it. And they are going to be pushed out of everywhere. They were pushed out of Southeast Asia. They're being pushed out of Africa. They have reasserted themselves in a way in the Middle East. Through hybrid methods, they are reasserting themselves. Like I always warn, they were pushed out of Southeast Asia militarily, but they have reasserted themselves through the National Endowment for Democracy and this invasive, basically U.S.-sponsored sedition. They're just basically politically capturing, brainwashing, indoctrinating people in their own country against their own best interests. This is kind of a way of the empire reasserting itself, and it works. This is why it's so important that people fight back against this. But yes, this is what we're going to see. The French, I mean, they had an empire. It was always weaker than the British Empire and obviously the American Empire. And so if there's going to be cracks that form, it'll form first with the French. It's interesting, speaking of the French, and not to just ramble on here, but we saw that French-trained brigade.
Oh, yeah.
And we predicted that was going to end in disaster before it even started, and that it is exactly what happened. The French don't know how to fight a war like this, and Western military power is outdated, and it's off the mark. They need to reinvest in it, and they're not going to.
Thank you for your super sticker, Yora. And then Azam asks, opinion on the recent escalation between Pakistan and the Taliban. Could this be linked to a U.S. method of disrupting China's trade?
Absolutely. The U.S. arms and backs militants in Pakistan all along the China-Pakistan economic corridor. If you look at it, it goes from China through northern Pakistan, northwest down to southwest Pakistan, Baluchistan, and you will see bombings and attacks on infrastructure projects almost every month. You see the BBC report on it, and they always report it out of context as if it's an isolated incident. They never explain that since 2011. In the United States, they've been writing policy papers talking about supporting Baluchistan separatism, to carve off Baluchistan, turn it into a U.S.-backed client regime, and chopping the Belt and Road Initiative off at Baluchistan. This is what they're doing. They're doing it in Myanmar also. They have been backing a U.S.-backed opposition to seize control of the country politically. Short of that, they're just giving them weapons to destabilize the country and also specifically attack Chinese factories, investments, and infrastructure projects.
Yeah. Let's see. This one is a question for you. I saw. Where was it? Right here. Question for Brian. I've seen a subscriber of yours. I've been a subscriber of yours for a while now. Would you one day do a Q&A live stream? I know me and a lot of your followers would appreciate that.
Well, actually, I had stopped doing live streams for the longest time, but now almost every weekend I've been doing live streams, and I don't monetize my YouTube channel for a variety of reasons, and I have nothing against people that do monetize their YouTube channel. It's just not for me. So when you ask questions during my live stream, I star all of them. So you just write the word question in all caps or a big capital Q. I will star it and I will answer it at the end of the session. I try to answer almost all of them. And for people who are not familiar, Scott, you do monetize your YouTube channel. So if people want to ask questions, they have to do it through, I'm not really sure how it works, but you have to donate a small amount. And this helps sustain creators, because I don't think people understand this is basically a full-time occupation. You have to, I mean, even with support from my audience, it just eats up all of my time. It is a full-time thing. It's stressing. I mean, like you and I, Scott, we have to watch videos of people being blown. We have to know what's going on. So we have to watch everything, including horrible things that you just, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And I think it takes a toll, even if you don't want to admit it. It takes a toll over time. So yes, we appreciate that support, and each channel does it differently. So if there's a channel that you like and you want to support, try to figure out how they're doing it. It's not one size fits all.
And when you guys do that, it makes me feel like I'm doing something important. Like, and I don't mean that I need to feel like that or anything. I think what I'm doing is important, but it reaffirms that the hours that I'm putting in for free and the years that I've put in for free before this, like Brian did, to build what we have and to work on what we have, it means so much. So I see this. Azam is always in here. You know, we already answered this question, but we see this. And it's like, this is one of the people who has been here following me forever. They like what I do so much that they're willing to donate. And that is so like fantastic. It really does keep you going. And it's not just because of money or anything. So yeah. And remember that you don't have to pay money to ask a question. I just go to those first. I will always answer those first. And then I go in to see some other questions. So let's see. We got another one. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it, man. Remember, guys, you can always ask questions with these if you have questions. Looking through.
And I'm okay, Scott. I'm not in any kind of rush, so I can.
Oh yeah,
hang in
for
here.
sure.
I'm already up for the day.
Just looking for questions. Europe has no leverage and will do as America says. Remember Afghanistan. If you say, if the U.S. says we're out, Europe will follow. Trump says 6 months because Biden has stuffed Ukraine with arms. So this is the thing we talked about earlier. Do you think that this conflict is going to end in 6 months and he just has to do this to sort of wind it down? Or do you see this continuing in the way that it has continued?
As far as I can tell, the United States wants to keep this going for as long as possible, because the goal is not necessarily to win. Ukraine is, they don't care about Ukraine. They haven't from the very beginning. They never cared about Ukraine. It is about extending Russia to the fullest extent until there's no Ukraine left to extend it with. That is the goal here. And what they have to do is make it look like they're doing something else other than that, feeding Ukraine feet first into the meat grinder of proxy war. That's what they have to make it look like. It's something other than that. And they're absolutely right about Europe. The European Union was a project specifically to politically capture and control Europe. The special interests that control the collective West, that is what they have used to subvert, short circuit, sidestep European sovereignty and Europe's best interests. And I remember distinctively before the special military operation began, I thought for sure Europe was going to pivot away from the United States because they had a constructive relationship with Russia. They were getting cheap energy from Russia. It was making their industry competitive. And they were even making inroads to work with China and connect to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I thought for sure, because their best interests demanded that they continue pivoting in that direction, that they would, but they didn't, because political capture is a very powerful form of control, and it will override a nation and even a region's best interests. This is why I continuously harp on the NED and agencies like it. Political interference. It is America's super weapon. It is more powerful than any missile that Russia can develop, any type of drone China can develop. It has to be taken seriously. People have to, because it's not glamorous and it doesn't attract headlines. People overlook it, but it is one of the most dangerous weapons the United States still has and uses.
Absolutely. I mean, who would have guessed 3 years ago that the Ukrainians would still be marching in lines to go die for this? I mean, it's so obvious to everybody. It was obvious to the people who were not on board with it from day one. It was obvious to most middle ground people after a year and a half. And now it's so apparent that the Ukrainians should stop for their own well-being, for their own personal and national self-interest. And they just keep going. because that's the power that the West has, that the money and the influence and the narrative driven media control, just everything all aligns with this almost ideological drive that it's fanatic and you can't get rid of it. We need to keep open discussion, truth, explore. Ukraine is collapsing. NATO is failing. Propaganda is incapable of sustaining the narrative. Okay, and I'm always careful with this the other way too. Be very careful to say that NATO is failing because there are long plays. There are long games that can be played out here where, yeah, you might lose a battle. You might lose the Battle of Ukraine, but what does the Battle of Ukraine mean to the United States? It was specifically chosen because it doesn't matter to the United States. It's something that can be used against Russia and be thrown away and forgotten about. So, yes, the NATO might be losing in Ukraine, but if the Russian position is so overly damaged from this operation into Ukraine that they can't do anything else, and then the US can continue doing things in other places that put even more pressure and continue to suffocate and isolate Russia, then Russia has lost, right? If they are able to in the future separate China and Russia from their energy relationship, then Russia has lost, NATO has won, and the West can focus on China. So you got to be very careful about, again, doing the exact opposite of what we just talked about, where you don't want to get emotional. You don't want to assume that you have everything on lock. The game is still being played. The chess match is still happening. You're just watching, a rook get taken in Ukraine by Russia, but Russia could be moving their queen to take that rook, and then the queen gets captured, right? So you got to be very, very careful about how you analyze and move forward when you're talking about these sort of things. Appreciate both your work. Great seeing Brian on again. It's great to have Brian on again. Let's see. What kind of level or proof? This is a good question. What kind of level or proof would you need in order to believe that there are North Korean troops in Kursk? Personally, for me, I don't not believe that there are North Korean troops in Kursk. My whole thing is, first off, why does it matter? Is it actually affecting the battlefield at all? Could those North Koreans just as easily be Russians? Does that make any difference on the battlefield? And I guess in terms of actual proof, I would like to have an identifiable North Korean individual presented in a way that basically removes any doubt that they could be from the eastern part of Russia, because just because their eyes are like this does not mean that they are North Koreans. And that seems to be the only evidence that anybody's willing to put forward. And I was watching Asian Russian soldiers getting killed, on Ukrainian drone footage and stuff in the first year of the war, in the second year of the war, and into the third year of the war. So there have either been North Koreans here the whole time and they all just kind of look alike, or Russia has a large Asian population and that's just sort of the situation. Brian, what would you need?
Yes, well, I mean, considering how much Ukraine has lied about all throughout this entire conflict, well, virtually everything they say nothing that they say can be trusted. And like you say, they're in Russia. They're in internationally recognized Russian territory. So who cares? What difference does that make? How does that matter? Why does that matter? And I remember when they first started talking about this, they were talking about how North Koreans were malnourished. They're like 5 feet tall and they've never fought in any sort of armed conflict. And so, just like you say, Scott, if they are there, shouldn't that be a high point for the Ukrainians? Shouldn't this be an advantage for them? But obviously, clearly it isn't. So like nothing that they're saying is adding up. So I would like to see evidence. I would like to see reports on how the North Koreans are fighting. What tactics are they using? What weapons do they have? Like this is all information that you would have if they were really there in large numbers and fighting. You would have that information and you would be able to write those articles and reports about these details, and that would make it a little more convincing to me. As far as I'm concerned, so far it just sounds like a Bigfoot sighting to me. That's what it seems like.
Yeah, it's been like this the entire war too, right? I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting for Iranian missiles. Russia got sanctioned 4 Iranian missiles that were transferred to Russia over the Caspian Sea. And we have yet to see a single one of these being used almost a year on now, I believe. We're getting close to when this was first being talked about. So that, the U.S. made something up. It might have happened. It might not have happened. We haven't seen any proof of it. It's been months now. The Russians are not obviously using these missile systems if they were received. And but the sanctions were levied and everybody forgot that it was even a talking point. And I think this is one of the most important aspects of how the U.S.'s information control is so strong, is that we have the memory of goldfish for some reason, and we just forget that they lied to us and that they will lie to us again, and they will lie to get whatever advantage they need. And this is not just an American thing. This is a human condition where we like to lie. It is easier to lie than to tell the truth in most situations. So you just have to get wise, honestly, is how I talk about it. You should always second guess anything that you read, anything that you see, anything that you're told specifically. Second guess it. Do your own research and try to figure out the truth if at all possible. This is actually a really good question, and this is something that I talk about. I have a series ongoing on my page. You've both been saying Ukraine's army will collapse any day, but that hasn't happened. First off, just a point of context here, I don't think me and Brian have said that it's going to happen tomorrow or next week. I think that the possibility is always there of a military collapse, but these things are not, predictions are just ridiculous. You're watching the overall health of the AFU day to day, week to week deteriorate. When I talk about collapse, I'm referencing the fact that the Ukrainian military's current position is to not retreat from a single point on the line. Don't give the Russians an inch. You are watching the Russians continuously, month after month, week after week, gain more and more territory at an exponential rate. It is growing. It is going to continue to grow, and it is not going to stop. I consider that a collapse of the Ukrainian military. They are not achieving their primary goal, which is to hold the line everywhere and not give an inch. So as they're backing up and as that continues to accelerate, I'm considering that as a collapse. When these sort of military actions are taking place and you have no retreat orders, that you should not see any Russian progress. And the way the Russians are fighting this war, they're not going on massive offensives that are going to force this sort of progress. So the fact that the Russians are just moving actively because the Ukrainians are now so weak in these specific areas, and this is not my opinion. This is Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, Ukrainian generals, Ukrainian captains, lieutenants, all the way up the CO and NCO line, talking about acute manpower shortages, incredible ammunition and equipment shortages, having one driver for one battalion to perform logistics and stuff. This is what a collapse looks like. It's just not a territorial collapse the way you might have seen in Syria or in Germany in the later months of the war, in the later year of the war. That will all come in time. But the Ukrainian military position is collapsing around them. So it might not happen tomorrow. It might not happen in 6 months, but the Ukrainians are failing to do what their primary goal. I consider that a collapse, or at least the start of a collapse. Brian, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. Neither one of us have ever said Ukraine is going to collapse on this day at the end of the year. We've never said that.
That's an American thing to say. That would be a U.S. Oh, the ruble is at 200. The Russian economy is about to collapse. That was April 2022. Sorry, Brian, to interrupt.
Yes, exactly. Neither one of us has done that. We both explained in excruciating and repetitive detail that this is a war of attrition, that what we've defined what collapse means, and we're not talking about everything just overnight and everything is gone. Just as Scott has described again in detail, we're talking about the Ukrainian military was at, let's just say 100% in 2022, and now it's down to whatever percent, maybe like 25%. That is a collapse. As a building is collapsing, It goes from 100% to 50% to 25% as it's falling.
Yeah.
And then it's a pile of rubble at the very end. So this is what we're talking about. I've even used the term slow motion collapse many, many, many times. And I've always referred to this as a war of attrition. This is not going to be a breakthrough and rout like, say, the US in Iraq in 2003 or the Persian Gulf War. This is a war of attrition. We've talked about how Russia is specifically choosing a strategy of attrition. Alexander Makiris of the Duran calls it aggressive attrition. I think it's a very good way of putting it. It's basically what Scott was just describing. And so that's what we mean. And, I don't understand I think some people have this question with good intentions, and they're wondering why Ukraine isn't collapsing in the way they want to see it collapse. And I think other people are saying it in the sense that, oh, everything is great for Ukraine because they haven't collapsed yet, but they are in the process of collapsing. It's going to take time. You cannot. I was just thinking about this, and I remember mentioning this at the beginning of the conflict, because people always say Kiev in 3 days. Ukraine is bigger than Iraq, has a larger population than Iraq did when the U.S. invaded. U.S. Subjected Iraq to years and years of sedition, sanctions, covert military operations before they invaded. They invaded with a full force. Iraq had no allies. Nobody was helping them. Nobody was giving them aid. Ukraine has been receiving, before the special military operation began, 8 years of NATO training, arms, financing, rebuilding Ukraine into a proxy to use against Russia. So I mean, think about that, and then you will understand why this conflict is so much larger in scale and why it's taking so much longer.
When you're talking about Iraq too, people forget that Iraq at the time of the first Iraq war, they were coming off of a 10-year war with Iran, which we were supporting. So it was. I mean, it's been that's a constant trope that I get tired of hearing, that that America, the last great American operation, was beating the hell out of Iraq, who didn't stand a chance, and then they somehow compare that to Ukraine, where Ukraine has a full NATO backing, which means that Ukraine is not Ukraine. Ukraine is just the tip of the NATO spear in terms of intelligence. So ISR, satellites. I mean, could you imagine if Ukraine didn't have AWACS and satellites? They'd be done. They'd be done. There'd be no chance of them fighting the Russians, right? The Ukrainians always know when Russian missiles are coming. They just know, because they have the U.S. telling them everything they need. They have the U.S. funding everything, or Europe, giving them financial backing, not just military backing, but paying salaries in Ukraine is a huge deal right now. And the West is keeping that afloat. So, it's not a war against Ukraine. It's not taking longer than it should. It is a much wider war and a much wider chess game that we've talked about. NATO and the U.S. has damaged themselves more than Russia. Looking at long term, I don't know how you could know that. I don't know. The U.S. seems pretty insulated, actually, from all of this. It feels like Europe, the EU might be taking some damage. But again, that's what vassals and proxies are for, right? They are meant to take the hits so that the hegemon survives. That's exactly what the U.S. is doing. That's what they're going to continue to use. Who cares if the German economy is garbage? That's what the U.S. wants. The U.S. does not want Germany to have a strong economy. They want them to have a good economy, but not a strong economy. They don't want them to be independent, self-reliant, and self-sufficient. They want them buying U.S. natural gas. They want them bending the knee to whatever the U.S. wants. Same goes for Britain, Germany. Same goes for the Philippines. Any of these outlying proxies, any country basically that you look at and you go, would the U.S. fall on its sword for this country like this country is falling on the sword for the U.S.? And if the answer is no, that's exactly what I'm referring to there. So I don't think that the U.S. has been overly damaged by this. I think that this was the U.S.'s plan. I think that it hasn't gone quite according to plan, but I don't know if many U.S. plans go according to plan. We kind of just roll with the punches and try to create something out of nothing. So I don't know if your comment is exactly correct, and I would just be very careful about digging yourself into this one-sided sort of thinking. But yeah, thank you for your donation, Name. I appreciate that. And then another one for Name. I disagree. Trump doesn't want this war. In his first term, he invited Putin to the G7 despite protests from the EU. Trump said, "We have a world to run." So first and foremost, what Trump wants and what Trump actually desires does not matter. It is not his, he is not the king of the land and he just prancing around doing whatever he wants on his time. He has responsibilities lobbies first and foremost, the people who helped to get him elected. He has responsibilities to America, the American citizens, which when you look at it, it might seem as though all of these things are counterproductive to the U.S. citizen, but we still live in the hegemon, and maintaining the hegemon is what I think most people would deem as best for the U.S. citizens. Is it best for the world? No. Is it the absolute best that they could be doing for U.S. citizens? Absolutely not. But maintaining what we have is vital, and Trump going gallivanting around solving all these issues may be potentially what he wants to do. I don't really believe that, but realistically that's never going to happen. So whatever Trump wants doesn't matter, and this is why I say again, voting for presidents does not change foreign policy, and it rarely changes domestic policy. Presidents are just the talking point, or the face of the permanent establishment who chose to allow them to run and chose to allow you to vote for them, is basically what the way I see it.
Well, I will even go as far as saying it's not even what Trump wants. He's a politician. What he says is almost always the exact opposite of what he actually is thinking or intending to do.
Yeah.
He needs to convince at least part, and this is what the Biden administration had to do, Obama, Bush, every single U.S. politician. They have a support base they need to pander to, and it's a very well-structured, well-controlled strategy of tension between left and right, and that's what they're doing. They're playing a game. It's theater to convince Americans that somehow they have a chance, they have a say. In reality, look at what Trump did during his first administration. Okay, he invited President Putin to the G7. He then started arming Ukraine, which is almost certainly the red line, the final red line that was crossed that convinced Russia they had to commit to the special military operation. Because if the U.S. began arming Ukraine, in addition to training them, there would be a point where critical mass was reached, where it would be just like Georgia in 2008, except a much larger, more powerful military attacking Russia.
Yeah.
Which again, I want to remind people that even the EU investigated the 2008 conflict between Russia and Georgia, and they concluded that Georgia started it. And they did, and they obviously did. And again, it was a microcosm of what the U.S. has done in Ukraine. Capture the country, militarize it, unleash it on Russia.
Yeah, I think that's where actually, well, let's do this one for the last one. Do you think the US, Japan, India, the Philippines will actually fight for Taiwan? I don't know about India. I don't know if that's really in the equation. Unlike Ukraine, Taiwan is an island, so it's easy for China to blockade them. Before Brian goes, because he's the expert on this, let me give my half-baked opinion. I think that Taiwan is not the same as Ukraine in its actual physical ability to cause damage to the Chinese state. I think that Taiwan is the foot in the door that will allow the US to, informationally at least, attack China in the same way that Crimea and then 2022, the invasion of Ukraine, was not necessarily, I mean, Ukraine has the ability to do a lot more damage to Russia, but I don't think that the US really thought that, Russia would even go in. And then when they did go in, I suspect that they thought that the sanctions were going to do a ton more damage to the Russian state. It's more giving them an excuse, right? It's like you're waiting for the other guy to throw the first punch so you can just unload on him and then claim that, you know, it was self-defense. That's how I see Ukraine. That's how, I think Ukraine turned into something else over the years that we've been seeing the conflict. But I think Taiwan is still just the you know, the bundle of explosives next to the open flame, and they're just waiting for that you know, that Chinese flame to come across and spark that, and then they can go on their economic war against China, try to isolate China, and do the same thing that they're doing against Russia.
Yes, I think I agree with that, Scott. For not being an expert, I think you did a pretty good job explaining that. They don't care about Taiwan. They couldn't care less about Taiwan. As a matter of fact, if you read U.S. policy papers, they all admit that any conflict over Taiwan is going to result in the destruction, the scouring of Taiwan, of any sort of industry, infrastructure, any sort of economy. Nothing will be left. They admit that. And you even have U.S. policymakers and politicians saying that we cannot, Elbridge Colby, who's now in the Trump administration, saying that the semiconductor industry in Taiwan should just be outright blown up by us rather than allow China to get it. So they have it's not China that has a scorched earth policy toward Taiwan. It's the United States, who claims they're defending Taiwan, that has a scorched earth policy toward the outcome of any conflict over Taiwan. And I agree. What this is about is making China look like the aggressor, even though it's internationally recognized as their own territory. And when you think about how many people they've convinced of this, despite how if you just look at the facts, how obvious it is a lie, it's amazing. It speaks to the power of U.S. information warfare, the control they have over a global information space. But just like Scott said, this is to precipitate a much wider conflict. We were just talking about a global blockade of China. It would be unprecedented, but this is something that they could use as a pretext to justify it. I mean, you could already see them shaping the narrative right now. As all of this unfolds, you can see in the media how slowly and surely they're shaping the narrative to do exactly like this. I think that's exactly what it is. India, not so much. Japan has no choice. The Philippines has no choice. They're politically captured, occupied by U.S. military forces. They'll do whatever the U.S. tells them to do, just like Europe has done. And they will suffer the consequences. Again, as Scott said, that is the point of having Japan and the Philippines as proxies, to take the punches for the U.S.
Do you think Taiwan will be the reason that the U.S. shuts down Chinese shipping lanes, or attempts to shut down Chinese shipping lanes in the South China Sea and potentially other areas?
I don't think anything is set in stone, but I think that's one of the pretexts that they're exploring. That maybe something with the Philippines, maybe a combination of the two. Who knows? Maybe something completely different. You see the U.S. provoking all kinds of trouble with China. People have to understand that since the 50s, if you go to the State Department's official website, their historical archives, they talk about the CIA running Tibetan operations with armed militants crossing over from India into China, killing people, destroying things. They were behind the Uyghur terrorism and extremism that precipitated a security lockdown in Xinjiang, China. And so thinking about it, the U.S. has been killing Chinese, destabilizing China within its own borders, putting U.S. troops within internationally recognized Chinese borders for decades and decades. They have been fixing for a fight all along, and yet they've convinced the world that China somehow is the problem. So it's amazing.
And even though we're talking about it and telling everybody about it, everybody's still going to be shocked and surprised and dumbfounded, and they'll believe the propaganda, and they'll, from both sides. And it's just tiresome, but we got to do it, right? We got to talk about it. All right. Thank you so much, Brian, for coming on. I really appreciate you. Everybody, go check out Brian's page. You can find the @ in the description of this video, The New Atlas. Go click on it. It should be the only blue thing on the YouTube video. Go find his page. Go follow him. Go watch his videos. They are precise and to the point, as I say. I like to mess around on my live streams, but Brian gets right down into the nitty gritty and presents everything the way it should be. So go check him out. Brian, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope to have you on in the future, my good man.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening.
And if I didn't get to all of your questions, guys, I'm sorry. We just kind of scroll through. I don't mean to misrepresent anybody or take your question out of context. Obviously, I can only read it and I just pick up on a single part of it and go off ranting about that. But I thank you all for being in here and being talkative and communicative. You guys make the show much, much more interesting and much more fun. So thank you all for being in here. Thank you, Brian. And I will see all of you on the next one. Goodbye.